I've personally always found it remarkable how much emphasis we place on speaking. Speaking's important, but let's be honest, we love it. Right now, you're attending a talk. Look where the spotlight is shining if you need metaphorical evidence for this point, right here. Over the next few days, you're likely to make statements like, I can't wait to hear Danny Kahneman talk. Or ask questions such as, remind me, who's speaking tomorrow? That's okay. Speaking's important. And yet, I'm going to be honest, as a speaker, here in this interaction, I'm not going to learn all that much. I already know 100% of this content. And I can already predict with perfect accuracy what I'm about to sandwich. See? You're doing the lion's share of the work here. It's incumbent on you to focus your attention and to maintain it for the duration of this presentation. It falls on you to comprehend my words and understand the ideas that I'm trying to communicate. It's your responsibility to find the personal relevancy in all the ideas presented here, find applications to your own life, and it is for you to make links between these ideas and the ideas with which you're already interested. You're doing the lion's share of the work. You outnumber at this event speakers 700 to 1. Far more than that if we count the digital audience. Make no mistake, you're attending a listening. This is not a talk, it's a listening. A listening is a phrase that far more accurately describes what is happening right now. And I love that we can flip the emphasis. And I think that it's right that we do. And you might find that if we do, we start languaging it differently. We start saying things like, I can't wait to hear Danny Kahneman tomorrow. Or who are you hoping to hear tomorrow? Listening is one of life's most important skills, and you don't need me to show you a bunch of data to prove that point. You don't need me to show you correlation coefficients that suggest that listening is linked to better learning. I don't have to show you correlation matrices that provide evidence that listening is related to better interpersonal connection. I don't need to tell you that in select instances, listening is linked to more enjoyment and greater appreciation. I will share with you this specific piece of data from a single survey. It turns out that humans, on average, spend 3 hours of our waking day listening. But what does that mean? To say that we spend 3 hours listening, does it mean that we spend 3 hours in silence? Does it suggest that we spend 3 hours patiently waiting our turn to talk? In my case, it definitely doesn't mean that. Does it mean, as people who love active listening, the traditional notion, that we should be repeating people's words in an effort to acknowledge them and to clarify their meaning? Wait a minute, Robert. What I'm hearing you saying right now to the audience is that listening isn't just parroting back exactly what you just said a moment ago. Yeah. No, what it means is listening is a many-splendored thing. Listening is a complex amalgam of states and skills that exist on a continuum. On the more, what would we say, passive, receptive side of the continuum, perhaps the foundation is silence. Indeed, it's easier to open your ears when you shut your mouth. But it's not just silence of the mouth, it's also a quieting of the mind. Not thinking while a person is speaking about your rebuttal, about the anecdote that you want to share back, the one-upsmanship, what question you're going to ask next. And that silence is the foundation upon which we build the twin pillars of attention and noticing. I didn't know it would sound so good when I practiced it. Attention and noticing. Those are easy to conflate, but they're actually subtly but importantly distinct from one another. Imagine this. 3 people attending this listening right now, all paying equal amounts of attention, but each noticing something different. Person A says, "What, did you just see? He just referred to this as a listening without drawing all that much attention to it. Interesting." Person B might notice my hand gestures and how I use those to punctuate points. And person C might notice what isn't being said, what's being left out. Do you know that Robert spoke for 20 minutes on listening and he never cited my research one time, not a single reference? Taken together, these things, silence and attention and noticing, provide the foundation for understanding, and that's critical to what many of us think of as listening. But those are the more receptive sides of the continuum. On the more engaged side of the continuum, we get questioning. Questioning I find to be an ironic form of listening because you're actually speaking when you do it. But questioning counts as an important listening skill because what it's doing is inviting more opportunity to listen. When I ask a question, I'm begging for more speaking so that I may listen more. Beyond questioning comes acknowledgement. Conversations are co-constructed, and so we must acknowledge the person, demonstrate to them in subtle and powerful ways that we're with them, that we're here, that we understand them. And this I do think is where the traditional notions of active listening have it right. I just don't think we clumsily need to say back everything that was just said. Sometimes maintaining eye contact, a small smile, displaying emotional expressions that are aligned with the emotional tone of what is being spoken, those are sufficient to acknowledge to the person, yeah, I'm here, I'm right with you. And then, anchoring the most extreme end, the most active and engaged end of listening, prepare yourself, is interruption. I know, don't run for the doors. Like you, I also think interruption is rude if we define it very, very narrowly. If what you think interruption is grabbing the turn to speak away from someone, well then by all means, that is rude. But most interruptions fall outside of those parameters. When your best friend is speaking to you and you say, wow, you've just interrupted them. For what is interruption other than overlapping speech, where 2 people are speaking simultaneously? When you say, no way, tell me more. Really? Amazing. All interruptions, even when you say, you've just interrupted. You just don't perceive it as interrupting. Well, I call it interjecting. Yeah, call it interjecting. A rose by any other name, it's interrupting. You just don't see it as rude because it does something distinct. Although you have spoken over the person, you have immediately returned the podium to them. You have immediately given them back the chance to speak. And when that happens, we are less likely to think it's rude and less likely to consider it an interruption. The linguist Deborah Tannen studied this exact phenomenon one time with a Jewish family in New York City who was celebrating a holiday. Did he say Deborah Tannen? Well, that's my research. He did cite me after all. Oh, it's a relief. What she did is she coded, that is, recorded, logged, tracked every single thing said during this holiday celebration. And what she found among this highly culturally engaged group of speakers is that they spoke over one another all the time. When someone said, you know what, the other person interjected a comment. People were likely to make jokes. They were likely to have a side conversation just for a second. They were likely to speak over one another, and none of them thought it was rude. They all thought it was a demonstration of their investment in the conversation. They thought, what greater gift could I give the speaker than showing them that I'm right here with them, but then by speaking right over them? And for people who don't come from that kind of engaged culture, people from more traditionally, let's call them polite, turn-based speaking cultures, that can seem rude because they're looking at things differently. And here's one of the things that Deborah Tannen found. The distinction between these groups is partially explained by the perception of pauses. In every conversation, the speaker searches for a word, pauses, takes a breath. And when they do, people from these highly engaged cultures, they view pauses as being huge. Even the smallest pause they view as enormous. And they think, well, they've stopped talking. It's a perfect opportunity for me to jump in. By contrast, culturally, people from the polite turn-based speaking cultures view even small pauses as relatively, or medium pauses as relatively small. So they're really wanting a huge pause to go by. They want to leave no doubt that the person has said everything they're going to say, period, before they take their turn. And I think just knowing that is interesting because it explains a lot of interpersonal difficulties. It's just food for thought. It helps us reflect on our own communication styles. And I love looking at cultures for this very reason when we think about how cultures listen. So another cultural example comes from Japan. In Japan, there's a phrase, and in English it would be translated as reading the air. Reading the air is a lot like what we would say in English, read the room. And read the room means take the temperature of the collective mood, mindset, etc. What I like about this notion is that it changes the equation from a one-to-one interaction, and it recasts listening, transforms it into a one-to-many interaction. In Japanese culture, it's important to have a degree of consensus and harmony and connection, and so it's important to know how much agreement is there in the room. Not only what is this person saying, but is the tide with them or against them? So you must listen for the overall context in which they are speaking. And that is considered, in Japan, a mature form of listening. A third cultural example that can give us a little bit of reflection on our own habits of listening comes from deaf culture. A little bit ironically, I think, because you might think, well, that seems strange to use words like hearing and listening with deaf culture. And indeed, I'll be the first to admit, those words are not associated traditionally with deaf culture. And people from within deaf culture often push against those words and think of those as distinctly unique to hearing culture. But if we back up, at least just here, right now, and we think of listening as something more than just hearing is just like this orgy of sound, and if sound is currency, the hearing people are all billionaires. Well, if we just think it's not that, it's really about receptivity. It's really about being able to take in and process and acknowledge. If we really think about listening as something more, then, well, of course it makes sense to think about deaf communication as including those components. And so, a researcher did a demonstration where they took two groups, a group of deaf people and a group of hearing people. And he had them engage in a complex task. This is what the task was. Everyone in each of the groups received a card upon which was an illustration. And you weren't allowed to show your card or the illustration to the other members of your group, but you could describe it. So this was going to be a communication-based task. And if together they could make a decision about which order to place the cards in, they would make a story that made sense. So here's what happened. The members of the deaf group spent 30 seconds looking at their cards, memorizing their cards, and after 30 seconds, they looked up and they started speaking. It took them a little under 3 minutes, and they made no mistakes. They never looked back down at their cards again. By contrast, members of the hearing group started speaking after 3 seconds. They almost never looked up from their cards. They interrupted one another. They often backtracked. It took them more than twice as long to finish, and they made 2 errors. Now, I'm not here trying to romanticize deaf culture or something like that, but I do think it's interesting, and it's interesting in this particular lesson from the person who conducted the demonstration. He said, it was as if the group of deaf people was primarily interested in communication, and members of the hearing community were primarily interested in thinking out loud. And so I just want to linger on that point here. The idea that your listening is motivated. You're listening for a purpose. You're listening to an end. You're not just listening as if it's one monolithic phenomenon. Consider this. When you listen to a YouTube video instructing you how to fix your refrigerator, that's one type of listening. And that's very different than the type of listening when you go to the symphony and you're trying to appreciate each note and how they fit together. One is appreciative listening, one is listening to learn for practical purposes. And both of those are different still than how a psychotherapist might listen to their client, listening to validate, listening to discern, listening to understand. And so here's the challenge I would like to give all of you. Over the next few days, without exception, you're going to be engaged in so many conversations with people you know, with people you've just met. And I challenge you to be clear on your own rationale for the listening. Am I listening to empower this person? Am I trying to give them a voice because maybe there's someone that doesn't seem like they feel comfortable or they've spoken up before? Am I listening to learn about them? Am I listening to validate their experience if they're complaining, for example? Am I listening to connect with them? Am I looking for mutual points of enjoyment or mutual experiences we've had? Just be very clear in each and every interaction you have what you're listening in order to accomplish. And when you start thinking about listening that way, you start thinking about listening as a tool. And here's my prediction. If you do this, when you leave here, beautiful Lake Como, and you go back to wherever you live, people are going to say, oh, Lake Como, it was amazing. How was it? Did you see George Clooney? They're going to say all that stuff. And if you do what I just challenged you to do, I think you'll be less likely to double down on the visual elements. Oh, it was beautiful, the mountains, the lake, the villas. It's a fine thing to tell them. But you might be less likely to emphasize only that. You might be less likely to emphasize the tastes and aromas of Lake Como. We had great wine, we had great meals. And you might be more likely to say, how is Lake Como? It was amazing. Listen to what I heard. Thank you.